So let's start the countdown with my #1 episode, Marty Cagan. We recorded this episode with the legend himself, so let's take a look and see.
Tell me what I need to learn. I will do everything I can to learn it. It doesn't take that long. That's the ironic part. It really doesn't if you're sort of pointed in the right direction. Now, I was super lucky to have somebody who was amazing at product coach me on this. But today there's a lot more. Now, this is separate from the issue of the noise we were talking about before, because unfortunately, the vast majority of resources I see out there, and you know I'm not including you two in this, that's why we're doing this call, but the vast majority of the resources are just trying to help people become a better feature team product manager, which is not useful. So what I want to help them do is become a real product manager, defining real as how the best companies actually do this. And that means they have to do some work. They have to learn the customers. They have to learn the data. They have to learn the business dimensions. They have to learn the industry. But you can all do that. And what I tell individuals is once you've done that, at a minimum, your leaders, your manager will recognize that all of a sudden you know a lot more than you did before. And by the way, what the things you know are incredibly helpful. I've seen people get promoted just from that. And then, of course, now they're in a product leader position where they can now influence more than just this. But to your original question, what can an individual do? They can raise their skills. The next thing they can do is try to win the hearts and minds of their own team. So that means going to your designer, going to your engineers, and helping them see the advantage of working this way. Now, most designers and engineers, in my experience, are not the problem. They were trained to work this way. They're frustrated they haven't been able to. But one way or another, you need to get on the same page with your team. So as an individual, you can do yourself and you can do your team. And then you can start showing your company what you're capable of.
What a statement. If you're an actual practicing product management, you've always seen these tensions. I certainly have when I was a product manager. I can remember a scenario where a designer said, this PRD doesn't have enough detail. I can also remember scenarios where designers said, you're getting too much into the design work and not empowering me enough. So you can always fall on one end, hey, not enough specification, or another end, you're jumping on my toes too much as a PM. It's a hard tightrope dance when you're working with design, and it can be equally as hard with engineering. What I think the takeaway from Marty's podcast is that one of the routes for you to improve the perception of product management, for you to improve the collaborative relationship with design and engineering, is to move people towards the product operating model, to move towards this better way of doing product. So if you're a product manager and you're in this situation where you are running up with issues where design and engineering are questioning the value of your role, you might want to think about what activities you are doing. It goes back to the heart of the advice that Marty is offering people, which is get out of usability. Don't get into the designer's job. Get out of feasibility. Don't get into the engineer's job. Yes, you're responsible for minimizing those risks and working with them, but really focus on value, viability. These things, when a product manager does really well, that is the essence of moving into the product operating model. And I know a lot of people, they live in this world where they're not in the ideal product operating model. And what Lenny and what Marty and what Shreyas and what Chamath and what all of these influencers are pushing us towards is trying to move towards a better way to work. This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. If you're building a SaaS app, at some point your customers will start asking for enterprise features like SAML authentication and SCIM provisioning. That's where WorkOS comes in, making it fast and painless to add enterprise features to your app. Their APIs are easy to understand so that you can ship quickly and get back to building other features. Today, hundreds of companies are already powered by WorkOS, including ones you probably know like Vercel, Webflow, and Loom.
WorkOS also recently acquired Warrant, the fine-grained authorization service. Warrant's product is based on a groundbreaking authorization system called Zanzibar, which was originally designed for Google to power Google Docs and YouTube. This enables fast authorization checks at enormous scale while maintaining a flexible model that can be adapted to even the most complex use cases. If you're currently looking to build role-based access control or other enterprise features like single sign-on SCIM or user management, you should consider WorkOS. It's a drop-in replacement for Auth0 and supports up to 1 million monthly active users for free. Check it out at workos.com/Aakash to learn more. That's workos.com/Aakash.
Today's episode is brought to you by Maven. The problem with most courses online, like Udemy, is there's no live component, and the instructors aren't experts in their fields, they're professors. At Maven, you get direct live access to experts and operators from the world's best tech companies. You can't get that access anywhere else, in any university, and you usually can't find them on YouTube either. I've featured so many of Maven's experts in the newsletter and podcast for that reason. To help you out, I've put together a collection of courses I recommend at maven.com/x/Aakash. This includes courses like AI prototyping for PMs, product sense for PMs, and getting an AI PM certification. Visit it now at maven.com/x/AAKASH. And when you look at this better way to work, there are very few times you'll see design and engineering upset at product. So when you see design and engineering upset at product, when you see those viral X threads going around about who even needs a product manager, that is a sign that there's a breakdown in the product operating model happening somewhere. In my experience, the most common drivers of this breakdown are, number one, bad product leadership. The product leaders aren't empowering the PMs enough. Number two, product managers who aren't senior enough. The product managers are running around focused on project management and keeping up with their communications, and so they can't actually drive strategy. And then number three, and this is perhaps the most insidious one, is that the teammates, the designers and the engineers, have never understood what it is like to work with an empowered PM. And I think that's the huge opportunity that a lot of people have, is to help socialize what it's like to be an empowered PM. We had Mike Davey on the podcast. What was the lesson from him? You have to evangelize this new way of working. And I think that's the lesson we should all take away from Marty Cagan. It really bums me out when I hear so many people sad about, I'm in a feature factory, I'm in a feature team, and that being the majority of PMs. But I think the takeaway is, let's slowly chip away at this with the right types of focus, the right types of use of our time, taking Shreyas's L&O framework, Marty Cagan's product operating model, Lenny's best practices, and putting it all together. I think that there is a route for PMs to actually enjoy their jobs and succeed. Let's move on to our second lesson with Melissa Perri.
I personally like the memo, followed up with a slide deck. And I find that that's good. But no matter what, if you're a leader, you're going to be repeating yourself on the strategy like 80 times. And I laugh sometimes when leaders are like, man, I've said this like a million times. Why do I have to say it 1,000,001? And it's because the rest of the company didn't do the work to figure out the strategy. So they usually weren't as heavily involved. The people who weren't as heavily involved, let's put it that way, they don't have as much context as you do. So if you're not repeating yourself 100 times, then it's not sinking into other people. And that's why as leaders, you got to go over and over and over and make sure it's digestible in different ways. So that's where all these communication tools become really important. But I think like canvases, value proposition canvas, McKinsey 3 Horizon model, like a bunch of Gibbs models on his blog, all of these are great ways to start to think about what should our strategy look like and where do we want to place our bets and how do we want to communicate it. But then I think you just have to pick what's going to be best for your company and culture and then commit to that.
She really nails it here because we're always wondering, how should we encapsulate, demonstrate, socialize our product strategy, right? As PMs. And I can remember examples where I've built a deep product strategy. I've explained it to the CEO and the CEO still doesn't get it, right? How common is that? That we run into these scenarios where people might even nod their heads at the meeting. Your VP of product, your chief product officer, your VP of marketing, and your chief revenue officer all sit, listen to your strategy, and they say, yep, that's all good. And then a week later, they don't have an understanding of our product strategy. That is the curse of being a product manager. And I think that as a product manager, we need to think about putting our product strategy into multiple forms. Like she said, a memo, that's like the tried and true way. But then on top of that, maybe a slide deck with more visuals, and then maybe a prototype, and maybe wireframes and mockups, maybe a video if you can afford to do it. There are so many different spins we can put around the packaging of our product strategy. The mistake that most product managers make is that they don't spend enough time on building a good product strategy. And because they don't spend a lot of time building a product strategy they really have conviction in, when it comes to repackaging it 80 different times, they're like constantly evolving the strategy, constantly improving it. And so the way to get this approach to socializing your strategy to work, I think, is spend a lot of time up front, even before you've even developed the strategy, and use that upfront work to then drive the all socialization and repetition and repackaging that you're going to create into so many shapes, forms, and sizes of your strategy. But a big takeaway from Melissa is you have got to prioritize strategy and create that time for work. And as we were just talking about with the takeaway from Marty Cagan, there's all these things that are coming up, all these project management tasks, all these execution tasks that your bosses will still want you to do. And the toughest job as a PM is making sure that you have a sound product strategy. And I would add on to this a lesson from my own, a personal failure that I had. When I was at a firm, I only thought about the product strategy in terms of those artifacts and levers on which I had power. But it's very, very important to also think about the product strategy in terms of what other teams are doing and what levers they control. So when I was tasked with improving activation and they were tightening the credit box on another team, activation was inherently going to go down. And so then you need to be able to bring up that lever around the credit box in order to improve your lever. And so really good product strategy is really wide thinking. It's not just about your artifacts. You make time for it and then you repackage it and say it again and again. Lesson 3. Let's move into Chloe's sheet.
It's tiring, but I learned a lot. And honestly, they are the fastest engineering groups I've ever witnessed in my life. No fear. They're so efficient, low-key a little mean, but almost like direct to a point. And you've probably seen this culture too, where you're just so direct, but they get stuff done. They're not like trying to negotiate with you and be like, that ticket's gonna take like 2 weeks. When do you need it done? And I'm like, they're like, okay, we can do this. Yeah, we can do it. Yeah, tomorrow. Yeah, I can do it right now. And I'm like, you guys are machines. Like, you're so talented. One of my favorite parts working on TikTok was their hackathons. They were crazy. They were so absurd because, like, I don't know what it is about Chinese culture. Part of it is very professional and very hierarchical and really, like, rigid. But another part is extremely out of pocket. Like, if we were watching an all hands, people would be like, oh my God, he's so handsome. In the comments, like, what a handsome man. And we're like, oh, we love him. He's our God. It's like very fan-based. And have you seen those like live stream apps where the comments float across the screen? Okay, well, in a very Chinese streaming setup, when you enter a comment, it will float across the screen and just that's it. There's a bunch of comments. So that's what some of our all hands were. So it'd be like a professional all hands and it'd float and it'd be like, oh my God, he's so hot. So that was hilarious. So then the hackathon, some of them would, I forget, but it was something along the lines of, oh, you don't have to find a partner. Here is an AR effect where you can find your perfect partner right here. And it's like an anime person. I'm like, damn, there are a lot of dating ideas. They're really funny. Some of them were straight troll, like type products. I'm like, dude, these guys got jokes, man. It's so good. It's so innovative and funny and like unhinged.
I love these insights from Chloe about TikTok culture, and in particular, what she's saying about how great the engineers were at TikTok. Later in the podcast, she talks about how if you give them something that you might have taken 2-3 weeks at Meta or 2-3 weeks at Discord, they would just get it done in a day at TikTok. And I think that that's so underrated. And I want to triple down on this point for people listening, which is find great engineers. I have been in scenarios also when I was at a firm, for instance, where I had an engineering team that wasn't interested in building product features, wasn't interested in moving fast, and was focused on the engineering career ladder. When you have that, you have to bring that up to your boss. You have to emphasize that to your boss's boss. You have to take that understanding that, hey, look, on the engineering side, we're not getting there. From the product side, things are working well, but on the engineering side, they aren't. Because when you work with a great engineering team, like at TikTok, your mind just opens up. You're just like blown away, like, wow, like things are going so fast. So when I was at Apollo, we would create entire new products like AI email writer in days and ship them. And there wouldn't be any delays, right? And so constantly, if you're a founder or if you're a PM, be evaluating your product management teams. And I think one of the greatest hacks for PMs who are in a job is to go work with engineering teams that are actually good and get away from the teams that aren't. Now let's move into our lesson 4 with Satyajeet Salgar.
I think especially in growth companies and innovative products, right? Like you are taking some amount of, you don't, everything is not scaling product market fit. You're trying to find product market fit in a lot of these things. And so you have to take some, like by definition, right? Like you want to take some amount of bets, and some of those bets will not work out. And again, I think you should also have a sense of, is this, to your point, confidence in sort of, you're very confident it'll work out and the payoff is small, or is it like, you're not sure, but if it works out, it really, really works out. So I think you should have that as well, right? Like you don't want to take a low confidence, low return bet. You want to take a low confidence, extremely exponential return sort of bet. And so I think even understanding that as you're placing these bets is super important.
What a great point by Satyajit. If 100% of your product launches are succeeding, you're not risk averse enough. You're not taking big enough bets. And I think that people do this because they realize that if they ship something that doesn't work or is risky in their 40% that they've allocated, and something fails in the 60% that they've allocated of sure bets, they could end up with 30-40% success rate. And I too have fallen into this problem before. I remember when I was at ThreadUp, we had an entire quarter on a squad where all of our sure bets fell through, and we had something like a 10% success rate on that squad. That squad was actually responsible for visitor to first purchase conversion, which is one of the most important squads at ThreadUp. The CEO's eye was on it. The president's eye was on it. Everybody was concerned. And so I understand why people might be conservative, but I think that if you really want to make a mark, if you really want to have a retrospective on your quarter, when you see that 70, 80, 90, 100% success rate on what you shipped, you should ask yourself, how do we think bigger? Because it might be the case that you're being too incremental. And when I look back at some of the quarters where we had a growth team that 100% of our experiments hit, when you look at the sum total of what that growth team did, they might have only moved the needle on an output metric 2 or 3%. And at that point, it's unclear whether all these incremental product metric gains were actually worth the ROI, whether that team should even exist. And so anytime you're starting to feel too comfortable in a PM job, you should get uncomfortable yourself. Let's move on to lesson 5, our 5th most popular episode with Diego Granados.
Yeah, one of the things to understand when it comes to reaching out to people, especially hiring managers, recruiters, basically anybody that you're looking for a job, is you have to understand that, well, yes, it's it's about you and finding a job, you cannot make networking about you. Networking is a two-way street. Networking is something where you have to, offer something to people, whether it's something as simple as giving them an article that you think would be interesting to them, giving them, an opportunity to learn something new. There has to be some exchange. I know it sounds like an awful word to say when you're looking for a job, because this is of course not about bribing anyone. It's more about you need to give people something, even if it's a meaningful coffee chat, but you have to give them something. So specifically for hiring managers,
You have to give them something. I think this point from Diego is really important because there are so many job seekers I see who they're just kind of caught up in this volume mentality. Let me send out 15 messages to people at the company to request a referral. Well, if you're doing that, if you're sending out 15 messages, make sure that you're offering value in each one of those messages. And in general, I think the ROI is much higher to have 4 messages where you offer value. And what I've been seeing in the job market is that the tighter the job market gets, the more extra value you need to provide. In 2021, 2022, it was okay to just shoot out a cold message and say, hey, can you refer me? In this market, it's much better to share, like you said, an article or a work product or a meaningful coffee chat. Making sure that there's an exchange of sorts actually encourages people to support your referral more so that you don't have a weak referral, but you actually get a strong referral. That helps you not only get interviews, but I've actually seen it make a big difference with whether people get offers as well. And so I think it's really important to think about networking as an exchange instead of a one-way street. Let's move on to the 6th lesson from Ravi Mehta.
And that's really important, but it doesn't take away from the need to focus on execution. At the end of the day, I worked with a Spotify product leader, and he had this great saying, which is, quality is your product's most important feature. And if you don't ship quality first, everything else that you deliver is going to get undermined. And I think you can sort of see that in the success of Spotify versus Tidal. Like Tidal had every reason to win in the streaming wars. It had these, relationships with really stellar artists, some exclusive content on the platform, a focus on quality. But the core moment-to-moment listening experience on Spotify was so spotless. You could, listen to an entire song without it skipping. Songs would start immediately after you hit the play button. And that's a great case where, at the end of the day, the product strategy didn't matter because the execution on the product was a lot better.
For all the hoogaboo about strategy, and we just talked about strategy with Satyajeet Salgar and with Marty Cagan in lessons 1 and 4, I wanted to include this lesson here in 6 from Ravi Mehta. Bad execution is going to ruin a great strategy. Low quality is going to ruin a great strategy. And I've seen this time and time again. And I think this is why you see your senior product leaders asking your junior PMs to focus on execution. And I think this is the criticism I might have of people who overly denigrate execution work. Execution matters. And execution matters because quality matters. I think Linear is a perfect example of this. We actually have Kari, the CEO of Linear, coming on the podcast soon. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how important quality is. But I love the example Ravi has here of Spotify as well. Spotify has impeccable quality. You might think, oh, they're not shipping many features, but actually they're shipping a lot of quality features consistently. And that's what's important, is to increase the quality bar. I think Apple is another perfect example of this, where they're always improving the quality bar. And I take this away as one of the most important lessons. Let's move on to lesson 7 with Gautam Krishnan.
What I've seen is that most PMs are so focused on the roadmap that they actually miss out on the big picture. And big picture is not required all the time also. But it's important and required, especially when you think about long-term planning. And what I mean by long-term planning is typically, if you're in a big organization, it's, let's say, 6 to 9 months. If you're in a startup, it's most likely between 2 to 3 months. Instead of getting stuck, if you're especially a senior leader in the organization, it's very important to step back, understand from the shoes of the CEO or from the head of the marketing or from the the shoes of a CFO, why are they trying to solve a particular problem? What is most important for them?
And this, I think, this lesson from Gautam really brings it home, the tension that we've described from strategy and execution, which is that you have to have that laser eye to execution on the day-to-day. And then when it comes to long-term planning, one of the magical things I've found is basically saying, I'm out of office for planning for the week, right? You need to, when it's that yearly planning, like you said, in a big company, or that quarterly planning in a small company, free up your calendar, free up your brain space. In fact, strategy, a lot of it is brain space. It's about not having meetings. It's about putting something down, like we said in our 1 hour snap strategy process with Ed Biden, and having your brain marinate, react to that strategy, improve that strategy. And I think this is one of the most effective concepts that some people miss out on, which is I almost want to have a dual track working style as a PM. When it's planning, I'm going hard on strategy and on these types of elements, and I'm stepping into the big picture. And then when it's execution time, I am willing to dive down into 0 feet. And so it's that 0 feet to 10,000 feet straddle that I feel like is one of the unique magics that if a product manager has it, they are a true magician. Today's episode is brought to you by Gibson AI, the future of backend development. Imagine designing, deploying, and scaling your database as effortlessly as having a conversation. With Gibson AI, that's now a reality. Gibson AI is your AI-powered database engineer. In just minutes, you can chat with Gibson to create production-grade data models, deploy them on Gibson's cloud infrastructure, and instantly generate secure REST APIs. Connect your frontend directly to your Gibson-built database, or drop the API specs into Cursor, vZero, or Bolt to build a full-stack application seamlessly. From idea stage to millions of users, Gibson scales with you. Gibson optimizes your database as you grow and enables easy schema updates and migrations. So head over to gibsonai.com/Aakash. That's GIBSONAI.com/AAKASH to sign up for free and experience the future of automated data modeling. Let's move into lesson 8 from Pawel Huryn.
For me, the double diamond of product discovery is about exploring the problem space, structuring your knowledge, ideating, and testing your assumptions by experimenting. And what I call the third diamond at the bottom is about delivering value for the customers. So you first plan your work. If you work in iterations, those are sprints that you have in Scrum, but even if you work in approaches like Kanban, there is still some planning phase where you split larger stories to tasks for developers, and then you deliver that, maybe not in iterations, but as that the work flows through different stages. So, yeah, the first thing is to get rid of delivery and separate delivery as a separate stream, and embrace that all those phases, all those diamonds are interconnected.
I love this point from Pawel, and it takes a little bit of thinking to understand why it is so insightful. So what he's saying is that discovery is a diamond and then delivery is a diamond, but we shouldn't assume that they're so sequentially following one another. That in fact, discovery and delivery often have to happen in parallel. One line needs to connect to the other, needs to connect back. So there's this entire process that we need to think about when it comes to handling our work. We just talked about planning and execution as two dichotomies. I think the other way to think about it, that Pawel has added some texture to what Gautam was saying, is you need to think about discovery and delivery work as well, even while you're doing your execution, to enable yourself when you pop back out for that strategic planning to do it in a way that's effective. And so what I want more people to do is not assume they're planning. You know, a quarterly team that I would often see would be, okay, we're going to have the discovery phase for 4 weeks, then we're going to ship the thing in 1 week, and that'll be it. It's much better to say, okay, we'll do discovery for 2-3 weeks. We'll ship something, then we'll probably do a little more discovery, then we'll ship something again. Then we'll get to a finalized result. But there might even be a third or fourth cycle. When you think about the work that way, you end up having much higher impact because you don't just touch, let's say, onboarding once and then forget about it for 6 months, or you don't just touch your information architecture once and then forget about it. You are iterating on it at that moment. It's kind of like that marination we were talking about with strategy applied to this specific area you're executing upon. You're having more concentrated brain power marinating between design, between engineering and product management and analytics and user research, all focused in on one area. And I love this concept of, let's think about a double diamond of discovery where things are parallel. Now let's move into lesson 9 from Kyle Poyar.
Don't think that there are quick wins in pricing, right? It's something that feels so daunting to change. It's very disruptive for your customers, sales, marketing, product, the CEO all have their different opinions of it. And so it feels like the kind of thing that you don't even want to touch, let alone find a quick win in. But some of the quick wins are more analytical in nature. And so one of them that's probably one of my favorites is to do an actual data-driven retrospective on the last pricing change. I almost guarantee you no one has done this in the business. And if you ask people how the last pricing change went, you'll get a bunch of different answers, especially if you're in a fast-growing business when a lot of people weren't even there when the last pricing change happened. Some might say, oh yeah, I mean, we lost a bunch of customers, or yeah, it got a lot harder to sell, or oh yeah, I don't really remember, I think it was fine. Right? You really don't get that really objective source of truth. And what I tend to find when I do this analysis is I look at what happened to win rates or conversion rates, what happened to time to close, what happened to starting deal size, what happened to churn, what happened to expansion, and you can look at the quarter or month before the pricing change and the quarter after the pricing change, and those two cohorts. I tend to find that revenue increased significantly. And that it often did not overly impact, or maybe didn't have any negative impact at all, to key metrics like conversion. And so you might not have gone far enough, but you might also realize that there's certain segments where that wasn't the case, or there were some benefits of certain metrics and some challenges. And so you maybe didn't get it perfectly.
What a great point by Kyle. And this goes back to something what I always ask product managers. When's the last time you did a feature results write-up? That is, you spent all this time on discovery, on writing a PRD, on delivery, on execution, on iteration through the double diamond, and then did you come back and review the thing? Did you do a data-driven write-up? And so I think this is actually one of the best quick wins for any PM who's coming into an area, is figure out what were the biggest changes that the team made where they didn't do a deep dive into the data. And then go ahead and do that deep dive. First of all, after you publish the deep dive, people are going to come back to you with, well, did you think about this? Did you think about that? I don't know if you defined this metric correctly. And that's going to really help you with your metrics understanding in terms of A, drivers, and then B, definitions. Drivers in the sense that sometimes we don't have an intuitive understanding of what's driving what until we actually go and analyze features. And then definitions because maybe it's in amplitude, you used monthly active users, but you actually need to use monthly active users with more than 1 minute, some field you didn't realize, and so all your numbers are wrong. So I find that there's this huge sort of training ground that happens for people when they come into a new job and then they analyze things. And as Kyle was saying in the context of pricing, if you do that in pricing, you're going to get even more benefits because usually pricing changes have a really long time before you're actually going to notice any impact. And so people often forget about looking back at those changes. So it happens to be one of the most fruitful areas to look backwards. Let's move into lesson 10 from Anuj Rathi.
Start owning the final outcome. And if you start owning the final outcome, be prepared to essentially say, what does it require for the company to solve this problem end to end? And not only from a product and technology hat, but end to end. Like if it requires people, and if it requires a difference in org design, if it requires changes in OKR structures, if it requires even HR or brand, make sure that you are really thinking about all of those things and put it down.
Anuj's podcast, this in-person podcast in this epic Airbnb on 100-foot road, basically the most famous tech road in all of India, was so insightful. And I love this point he's making here where he really opened my mind, because if you look at his career, he started as the first product manager at one of the most famous companies, Flipkart. He rose all the way to VP of product at Swiggy, but he didn't stop there. He then owned revenue, growth, sales, different elements, different business units. Now he's a chief business officer. Too many product managers just have their eyes set on VP of product, chief product officer, but that isn't really the end of the career. I think that you want to think about your career more holistically. And as a product manager, you want to be thinking about, like he said, what are the organizational elements? What are the people elements? What are the brand elements? If you can start to think about these in a more general manager hat sort of way, you're going to have so much more impact as a product manager. Plus, you'll have a much longer career. So let's finish up this tour through 50 of my favorite episodes with lesson 11 from Anthony Pierri.
I think that the purpose of a homepage is to function as part of your marketing assets. It's not, in my opinion, it is not a Wikipedia page. It's not to tell everyone everything that you do. It is to function more akin to the storefront. When you walk past, back in the day when we would go to the mall, I think malls actually are still doing okay in other countries, but in the US, malls have really died. And so when you used to go to the mall and you walk past the storefront, you would see, let's say it's a clothing store, maybe H&M. You would see 3 mannequins standing up there with outfits. And the idea was, can these mannequins entice me enough to go inside and see the rest of what's going on? And when I walk into H&M, what do I find? I find more than the 3 outfits. I find that there's a men's section, a women's section, a kids section, all sorts of different things that I maybe would be interested in.
I love this final point here from Anthony, and I wanted to end on this lesson because so many product and growth people get myopically focused on the product side, the product strategy side, the product discovery side, the product execution side, all of those things that we covered in the first 10 lessons, that when it comes to packaging, when it comes to how it looks on the homepage, when it comes to how we market the thing, how we create that storefront, they want to create a Wikipedia page. And that doesn't sell. Even for my own newsletters or for this podcast, even if I have 50 topics in a podcast, I can't create the storefront packaging for all 50. I have to pick 3 out of the 100 outfits, like Anthony said at H&M. And I think that that's a critical lesson and a final lesson for me from this set of 50 amazing podcast interviews that we've done so far is don't build a Wikipedia page, build a storefront. Those were some of my favorite takeaways from filming these 50 episodes. So let's end with my retrospective on the podcast, on working on the podcast alongside the newsletter. Raj Kumar asked, after 8 months of the podcast, was it a good decision? Are you happy with the growth so far? It's a mixed bag, if I have to be honest. The podcast has been awesome for learning for me. It's been awesome for connecting with people, and it's been awesome for being able to introduce my audience to some great experts. But I'd be lying if I would say it was all roses. I personally have been disappointed with how quickly I've been able to grow the podcast. If you look at the launch of Lenny's podcast, he really was able to catch fire, lightning in a bottle from the get-go. And I probably thought I could catch a similar fire, but I haven't been able to do that. And I think that there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, his timing was much better, where he launched basically in COVID when everybody was at home, had more time to listen to podcasts, and podcasts were popping off. Number two is he's had better and bigger name guests than I have had, where I've taken a little bit too much of the let me introduce somebody who's really smart who you may not have heard of approach to the podcast. And so he's really been able to use his guests. And then number three, he did have bigger distribution. Even if today you look at it, he's gaining like a couple 100,000 subscribers every couple months. I still am at 150,000 subscribers. The newsletter is growing at 5,000 subscribers per month. So I have a different distribution. I had thought that because I'm bigger on LinkedIn, I'll be able to grow faster than him, but I haven't been able to do that. And so the podcast has been a mixed bag. And in terms of the profitability of the podcast, I have actually lost a little bit of money on the podcast. We have had sponsors, but I have to pay for editors, have to pay for packaging and thumbnails, have to pay for shorts. And so all of those costs really add up. And the most significant cost actually from the podcast is I probably spend about half my time on the podcast, giving feedback to those editors, collecting guests, researching guests, shooting episodes, researching equipment, improving my equipment, reshooting episodes that were shot on bad equipment, right? There's so much time I've put into this podcast, and that podcast time has taken away from the newsletter. And the newsletter is highly profitable. So if you look at a highly profitable business, I've traded off time and growth also of that newsletter in favor of the podcast. And so while I've learned a lot and I've been able to introduce it to a lot of people, I don't think it's a sure thing that the podcast has been a good decision for me. I think it's kind of like how a lot of you product people and growth people might remember when your company had one core, awesome, successful product, and then they decided to invest 40% of the resources into another product. Well, they were able to get that product off the ground, but it's not growing as well as the core, and now the core is also growing slower. And so, am I happy with the growth of the podcast so far? No. What is my plan to go forward on this podcast? So number one is that guest selection that we were talking about. If you look at my podcast, we have like this barbell distribution. If you've heard of the guest, like Chloe Shih, the episode takes off. If people haven't heard of the guest and the only reason they're coming to check out the episode is me and what I'm selling about the topics that the guest is talking about, they're much less likely to come. And so what that's meant is even some of the people who I had invited on to the podcast and we had recorded episodes with, we're not going to be airing. And on top of that, people who we had planned recordings with, we're not going to be running with those recordings. Because me and the team have realized that it's really important to have huge guests. And what I had actually doubled down on as differentiators, A, quality, and B, length, neither of them actually are as important as guest quality. So that's the first thing. The second thing that they're not important as is packaging. Having a really concise topic, having really strong research. And if you look at that, sometimes my episodes will cover 3 to 4 topics. Like a common episode example that my team uses is Adam Robinson's episode. So we actually thought Adam Robinson was really going to grow the podcast because he has 100,000 LinkedIn followers. His followers are devout fans of him, and he was going to like and comment on our LinkedIn posts, so we thought that would help us grow. It turns out his podcast episode was a bit of a flop on my channel. And the reason it was probably a flop was because my audience is expecting product and growth content versus entrepreneurial content. And so the fit of his content with my audience wasn't so great, even though he was such a good guest. And if you think about my packaging, I packaged it up as, well, he's built a profitable $25 million ARR SaaS, but that wasn't necessarily the strongest packaging out there. If you look at people like Greg Eisenberg, he's packaging his episodes so well, where recently, for instance, he had a guest on, but the guest wasn't even featured in the packaging. The packaging was everything you need to know about DeepSeek R1. And so it's highly timely. It's based on these news items that people want to search for. And so that's been a huge growth lever. So I've been tracking Greg Eisenberg. I think he was at like 120K subscribers a couple months ago. Now he's at like 190K subscribers. Meanwhile, I've grown from like 4K to 4.66K. And so I'm realizing that there's some areas that I need to significantly improve on the podcast. And so that's what we're going to be doing for the next 50 episodes. And especially because I'm not earning money really on the podcast. In fact, I'm losing money. This is going to be the important period that determines the future of the podcast, is if I can successfully take the learnings we've had to grow it faster. And on the point of growing, if you have been listening so far, please do take a second to subscribe on YouTube, to follow on Spotify, follow on Apple, and also leave reviews and ratings on those places and comment on episodes. This engagement really, really helps with those platforms as I'm trying to break out of the flywheel. And I'd also invite you guys to feel free to comment on this video. What else should I be doing to improve the content? Reply to this podcast, reply to any of my newsletters and tell me what I should be doing to improve this podcast, because I really want to improve it for you guys. James Redmond asked, what's next for the podcast? So I already covered a little bit of it, but really what's next is amazing guests with amazing packaging and even better trailers. So some of the guests that I'm super excited about: Louis Lynn, the author of Decode and Conquer; Brian Balfour, the founder of Reforge; and people like this: Colin Landforce, one of the top voices in AI prototyping for PMs; Kari, like I mentioned, the CEO and founder of Linear. So I'm going to continue to try to double click on that. I've been sending out way more cold messages than I had ever before in order to get those better guests, those better topics. But what else should be next for the podcast? I want you guys to tell me. That's why I'm recording this episode, to give you a bit of the behind the scenes on how I've been thinking about things. When I look back at those 11 episodes that performed the best out of the 50 that we looked at, I definitely do notice a lot of elements where I could have improved, whether it was video quality or sound quality or trailers. And so I'm going to continue to move along those vectors and small incremental improvements, but it feels like guests and packaging are the most important. And I look at somebody like Peter Yang, who's been able to grow his podcast faster than mine. And you look at it, it's grown really heavily based on having Arvind Srinivasan, the CEO of Perplexity, and Amjad Masad, the CEO of Replit. And then he was able to take those and create viral promotions. For Arvind, it was around him not having a green card, or him being on a green card and not having a citizenship, I believe, actually. And then for Amjad, it was this tweet about what people in tech should run to in the era of AI agents, which was retweeted by people like Levels.io. And so both cases, he's been able to create this synergy between the packaging, the guest, and his promotion to really skyrocket the growth of his podcast. And my goal is to be one of the fastest growing podcasts. And so I really want to take this podcast there, and that's what's next. Preeti Gupta asked, how was your India tour? Will you be traveling more places? This is a really interesting question. My India tour was a smashing success. So we had almost an event every day in a bunch of cities: Mumbai, Bangalore, Delhi, and Jaipur. And those events were all sold out, standing room only. I didn't take that enough pictures and videos. We have been thinking about creating a vlog, though, of the pictures and videos we have. So comment below if you want me to create it. But these rooms were literally me sitting in the front with like hundreds of people sitting and then hundreds of people standing. It was amazing. And when I was walking around, when I was shopping at the mall, when I was at the food hall, when I was at the airport, even when I was at the hotel checking in, I was getting stopped by people and saying, "Oh, are you Aakash Gupta?" So I thought the India tour was a massive success. It goes to show that you need to get out there. And since then, my growth rate in India has really picked up its pace. Every podcast guest I talk about says they get hundreds and hundreds of LinkedIn connections from product managers on LinkedIn. So I loved the India tour. I felt like I just was so happy for months after. I had a glow about myself. And I got to connect with people and hear like, how is product management going for you? How is growth going for you? And so it was a phenomenal learning experience as well, the India tour. And so I do plan to travel more, but not so frequently. The problem with the India tour is it took weeks, but I still had a podcast and a newsletter to publish and a family to support. And with 2 small kids, that was too much of an ask for me. I had to cut back on my sleep, and I didn't like that. That's one of the reasons I became a creator full-time to begin with, is to have that balance, not have to constantly be cutting sleep. And so unfortunately, the balance wasn't right for doing too many new trips. But I do have some big news, which is that I'm actually moving to Los Angeles in May. And so this move is actually for business reasons. I want to spend more time in San Francisco, more time in Seattle. As we saw, my biggest episode is with Chloe Shih, and it was in person. And so I want to do more in-person episodes. And I want to continue to get you closer to the real movers and shakers in product and growth. And so, yes, I'm going to travel primarily to San Francisco and Seattle for product management events. There are some talks about me headed to Dubai to speak at a conference, to head to Boston to speak at a different conference. So I'm open to conference speaking events. But as far as tours where I have a whole team, there I had multiple people in India supporting the trip. I'm not going to be investing in that in the short term. Clement Cow asked, how has the last year with the newsletter been? And how do you plan to continue balancing the newsletter and the podcast? This is a really interesting question. So the last year of the newsletter has been phenomenal. We're talking in the beginning of February. My January revenue was up 250% compared to last January, which was the first month I went full time on the newsletter. So 13 and a half months into my journey of not being a full-time product manager and being a full-time creator, my revenue is looking great. Overall, the business is looking good, but my costs have increased as well. I now have people on my team, people supporting this podcast and people supporting the newsletter. And so there's this element where I want to make sure that the profit is growing fast, and the profit is growing pretty fast. However, when I look back at the last year, I do feel like in this last 6 months, my newsletter growth could have been much, much faster than it was had I not been working on the podcast. So for me, I'm facing this dilemma of how do I focus on it? And what I'm getting inspired by, again, is Greg Eisenberg, where he had started a podcast something like 3 or 4 years ago. Now it's taking off. So even Peter Yang, he had started his podcast 11 months ago. Now it's taking off. I'm only 6 months into my journey. So I'm trying to have that beginner's mindset and get inspired by my own newsletter. If you look at my newsletter for the first year or two, the amount of growth I was having was minuscule compared to the growth we've had in the last month or two even. And so what I remember is that Jack Butcher chart where it's like small, 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 and then immediate exponential growth. I'm still on that small, small, small part of the podcast is my hope. And in the future, I want to take it to bigger planes, bigger topics, broadly become one of the most popular tech podcasts. And so I'm hoping that the way I've hired a team will allow me to drive that. Mariah Williams has asked, how do you decide what to write about in the newsletter? This is a really interesting question, and it relates also to how I decide about the topics on the podcast. So for me, I consider my content calendar my most important product. The topics I write about ultimately determine success. And so what I do is I have hundreds of potential topics, and I'm constantly choosing and rank ordering that list and taking the best ones at any given time and putting them into my content calendar, and then spending 3 or 4 weeks researching that topic. So what I've learned is that people really like tactics and specifics over generalities. They like depth over breadth. And they like this dual track where I do things that help them in their career and things that help them get a PM job. So when I look at my content calendar over a given month, I try to make sure that I have that full mix, that I represent those lessons, that I have some getting a job content, that I have some PM skills content, and then I'm also well known for my company and market deep dives so that I mix some of those in every given month. So if we might have 5 newsletters in a given month, I might have 1 market deep dive, 2 getting a job pieces, and 2 career skills pieces. That's how I think about it today, is trying to create that package where if you're spending $15 a month with the newsletter, you're getting way more value through a few different types of topics. And if you didn't care about the market topic that month, hopefully you cared about the getting a job topic, or hopefully you cared about the career topic. And that's been my overall strategy. Okay, Chanel Basilico asks, what's been your biggest problem with the newsletter and podcast? The number one problem has been churn. So because it's a paid newsletter and it's $15 a month, you compare that to your Netflix bill with ads, that's $12. Only Netflix without ads, $20. So you're almost saying like, is Aakash's content as good as Netflix? And obviously, I'm not doing entertainment content. I'm doing useful content, educational content, tactical content, career content. And this type of content, I think, hopefully my goal is that I can try to create something that you use soon and that you immediately see some sort of monetary impact so that you don't churn. And ultimately what I have seen is that according to Substack's benchmarks, my 30-day churn is actually much better than benchmarks, but my 6-month and my 1-year churn is below benchmarks. And so what I'm trying to do is figure out how I can improve those retention rates. So every day I've started to do more discovery calls with canceled subscribers and new subscribers to better understand who are these people? How can I write the right content for them? And then I've also been doing a lot more digging into the data on my content calendar. So after we publish a post a week later, I go back and I look at how many free subscribers, how many paid subscribers, how many social impressions did we get? And I try to use that data in order to then feed back in with the user research and improve my retention. But creating a paid subscription business is a lot harder than most people tell you. And for me, I've been trying to work on my churn. All right, Amy Salome asks, how can we improve our job searching if we're not getting any interviews as a product leader? Okay, this is a really interesting question. So what I like first and foremost is that she's narrowed down the area of the funnel where she's struggling, not getting interviews. And then the next thing I would do is I would ask her follow-up questions about, well, how are you applying? Break down the different ways you are applying. If you're applying as cold, how many cold applications did you make and how many responses did you get? If you're applying via referral, how many did you do and how many responses did you get? And usually what you'll find is that there are certain channels that are more effective or less effective than you. And for most people, applying cold doesn't work. And so they then need to switch to more referrals. And they might even need to try out new channels like trying work products or creating a portfolio or writing content on LinkedIn to optimize their profile for inbound jobs. Ultimately, as a product leader, inbound and networking with recruiters are the two most important channels. So I'd double click with her and say, okay, let's take a look at those two channels, see what you're doing right, see what you're doing wrong, and diagnose within those channels how we can improve your strategy. So if you see here, I'm trying to take like that product growth approach to the funnel of job searching. And I think that's one of the most effective techniques to improve. JJ Tan asks, how do you get so much done? 2 newsletters, 2 podcasts a week. How are you doing it? This is a great question. So for the first 4 months of this podcast, we were releasing 2 newsletters and 2 podcasts a week. Actually, for the last 2 months, we've switched to 1 newsletter and 2 podcasts a week. Because what I realized was that having more newsletters wasn't necessarily driving more growth. Actually, for newsletters, the quality really matters. And we're actually considering changing the cadence on the podcast as well, because it is so much work to create and package all these episodes. So I'm not sure that me shipping so much with a slightly lower quality bar is a good thing, JJ, but thanks for noticing that I am shipping a lot of stuff. It just goes back to even my product philosophy. You got to ship stuff to learn. And so I'm trying to ship more. I'm trying to get more shots on goal so that I can learn more. And the reason I'm able to do that while still having work-life balance, where I probably don't work more than 45 to 50 hours a week as a creator, and ideally my goal is to work like 35 hours a week, is by having that team and then empowering that team and working with that team in the right way. And so having to switch out people who aren't the right quality team members, who can't operate autonomously, who aren't saving me time, has been one of the important levers for me to protect my time and improve my time and ship so much. All right. And Heather Inocencio asks, if you could have any 3 guests on the podcast, who would they be? So I think my 3 dream guests for the podcast are Nikita Bayer, Shreyas Doshi, and Brian Chesky. So those are 3 of the most prominent voices in product management. We're now putting it out into the ether. I would love you on your podcast, on this podcast, and I'm going to continue to grow this and improve the quality of this podcast to have you on. Everybody, thank you so much for 650,000 downloads, 50 episodes, 4.66K subscribers on YouTube, about 13,000 average listens for every episode. Really appreciate all your support. Please continue to support this podcast by dropping a like, commenting, subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find out about the podcast. You can find all the past episodes or learn more about the show at product-growth.com. See you in the next episode.